world knew him as one, a singular, explosive force of nature that ripped the 20th century in half. But on the top floor of Graceland, in the dead of night, when the screams of the fans had faded and the house fell into a tomb-like silence, Elvis Presley knew the devastating truth. He was not one. He was half. He was the lonely survivor of a cosmic deal, the lesser half of a soul that had been split in two before he ever drew his first breath. The world saw a king, but Elvis saw himself as a shadow, a phantom walking in the place of his brother, the one who should have been. This isn't a story about fame. It's a story about a haunting, a ghost story set not in a dilapidated mansion, but in the heart of the most famous man on earth. His ghost had a name, Jesse Garon Presley, and his story is the secret key that unlocks everything: the crippling loneliness, the frantic search for God, and the terrifying duality that would create a legend and then utterly destroy the man. The story begins not under the glare of stage lights, but in the suffocating darkness of a two-room shack in Tupelo, Mississippi. January 8, 1935. A biblical winter storm raged outside, mirroring the war happening inside Gladys Presley's body. She was expecting twins, a secret miracle for a family with nothing, but the labor was brutal. A desperate fight for life in the poorest corner of America. Shortly before dawn, the first child arrived, Jesse Garon. He was perfect, and he was perfectly still. There was no cry, no breath, just a profound, final silence that filled the tiny room and shattered the heart of his young mother. The country doctor, William Robert Hunt, worked frantically, but it was no use. Jesse was gone before he'd ever arrived. Grief, thick and immediate, choked the air, but the ordeal was not over. 35 minutes later, in a second wave of agony and shock, another child was born. This one screamed. This one kicked. This one was ferociously, defiantly alive. They named him Elvis Aaron Presley. The next day, Vernon Presley, a man broken by the loss of his firstborn son, took a small pine-wood shoebox to the local cemetery. There, in an unmarked patch of earth in Priceville Cemetery, Jesse Garon was buried. There was no headstone, no ceremony, just a secret sorrow planted in the frozen Mississippi ground. Gladys would never recover. She poured all her love, all her fear, and all her grief into her surviving son. He was her miracle, her everything. He was the one who lived. And so, from his very first day on earth, Elvis was defined not by his own life, but by the death of another. He grew up in a house of whispers, a house haunted by the specter of the boy who wasn't there. He was taught he was special, that he had the strength of two. He was living for both himself and for the brother he'd never met. This was not a memory. It was an origin story. It was the birth of a void inside Elvis, a black hole of incompletion that he would spend the rest of his life, his fame, and his fortune trying desperately to fill. But what no one understood, what he was only just beginning to feel himself, was that the ghost of Jesse Garon wasn't just a sad family story. For Elvis, he was becoming terrifyingly real. The boy who would become the king was not born with a sneer on his lip. He was a painfully shy child, a mama's boy who clung to Gladys's side, lost in a world of comic books and daydreams. He was an outsider, a loner, but he was never, ever alone. From his earliest years, Elvis spoke of his twin. He didn't speak of him as being gone. He spoke of him in the present tense. He would talk to Jesse in the quiet of his bedroom, confiding his deepest fears, his wildest dreams. To the family, it was a coping mechanism, a child's fantasy. To Elvis, it was a conversation. This communion with the unseen created a fracture in his personality. There was Elvis, the polite, respectful, God-fearing son who would do anything for his mother. And then there was the other one, the one who came alive when the music started. Watch the earliest footage of him. The transformation is chilling. The shy boy vanishes. In his place stands a snarling, preternaturally confident force of nature, hips swiveling with an arrogance that seemed to come from another dimension. He wasn't just performing, he was channeling. He was giving a voice to the brother who never had one, a body to the spirit who never walked. Jesse was the phantom. Elvis was the vessel. This profound, subconscious belief that he was living for two became the rocket fuel for his ambition. Every cheer, every #1 record, every gold-plated Cadillac wasn't just for him. It had to be enough for both of them. It was an impossible burden for a single human heart to carry. He had to succeed on a scale the world had never seen, because his success was the only proof that Jesse's life, however brief, had meant something. It was a mission, an obsession, a sacred duty that drove him from the shacks of Tupelo to the throne of a new kind of American royalty. Fame arrived like a tidal wave, a chaotic storm of money, adoration, and blinding flashbulbs. He bought Graceland, a palace for his mother, a fortress against the world. He had everything a mortal man could ever dream of, but the void only grew wider. The roar of 10,000 screaming fans was just noise, a hollow echo in the vast, silent chamber of his heart where his brother was supposed to be. In his moments of greatest triumph, he felt the deepest fraud. He was an imposter king. The real one, the better one, the stronger one, was Jesse. As the screams grew louder, so did the whispers of his phantom twin. The voice that had once been a comfort in his childhood bedroom was now a constant, nagging presence in his mind. It questioned his talent. It belittled his success. It reminded him, over and over, that all of this was built on a grave. The guilt was becoming unbearable. The world saw Elvis the Pelvis, the rebellious hero of rock and roll. But inside, he was just Elvis Aaron Presley, the boy who survived, and he was beginning to believe he didn't deserve to. His loneliness in the late 1950s became a palpable thing, an aura of isolation that surrounded him even in a crowded room. He felt like a freak, a man disconnected from the rest of humanity by the sheer scale of his fame. But his isolation ran deeper than celebrity. He was a twin without his twin, a feeling medical science now calls lone twin syndrome. He felt a constant, gnawing sense of being incomplete, a feeling that a fundamental part of himself was missing. It was a wound that no amount of money or adoration could ever heal. So he began a search, a desperate, secret quest. He started devouring books, hundreds of them, on every religion, every spiritual path, every mystical tradition he could find. He wasn't just a curious reader. He was a drowning man searching for a lifeline. He consumed theosophy, the works of Madame Blavatsky, the teachings of Gurdjieff, the poetry of Khalil Gibran. He was looking for proof that consciousness survived death, proof that the soul was eternal. He needed to know, with absolute certainty, that Jesse was somewhere out there, waiting. He was searching for a way to bridge the gap between worlds, to turn the one-sided conversation in his head into a genuine dialogue. To ward off the crushing silence of his own mind, he built a human wall around himself. The Memphis Mafia. They were his friends, his employees, his bodyguards. They lived with him, ate with him, traveled with him. They were there 24 hours a day, a constant source of noise and distraction. Their job wasn't just to protect the king's body, it was to protect his sanity. They were a buffer against the terrifying solitude he felt when the world went quiet. Yet even in a room filled with his closest friends, laughing at a joke, he would suddenly drift away. His eyes would glaze over, his focus shifting inward, listening to a voice that only he could hear. He believed Jesse was his guardian angel, a spiritual guide on the other side. He credited his twin with saving him from a fire in their childhood home, with guiding his hand during his rise to fame. This belief was his anchor, but it was also his torment. He felt a profound sense of responsibility to live a life worthy of Jesse's sacrifice, a life that was pure, spiritual, and meaningful, a life that was completely at odds with the temptations and corruptions of being Elvis Presley. This internal war was tearing him apart. His relentless search for answers led him to the fringes of spiritual thought, to psychics and mystics who promised him the keys to the kingdom of the dead. He wanted more than just faith. He wanted contact. He wanted a sign, a message, a voice from the other side. He was about to find a man who would promise him exactly that. A hairdresser and spiritual seeker named Larry Geller, who would lead Elvis down a path so profound it would change him forever. But this path, which promised a connection to his lost brother, would also put him on a direct collision course with the most powerful and ruthless man in his life, his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. A war for the soul of Elvis Presley was about to begin. In 1964, Larry Geller entered Elvis's life. He was more than a hairstylist. He was a spiritual guide, a fellow seeker who spoke the language of mysticism that Elvis had been desperately trying to learn. Geller handed him a book, The Impersonal Life, and for Elvis, it was like a bomb going off in his soul. It spoke of a universal consciousness, of a God within. It gave him a framework, a vocabulary, for the profound spiritual experiences he'd been having his entire life. He felt, for the first time, that he wasn't crazy. He was a spiritual being. Elvis became a voracious student. Guided by Geller, he transformed his bedroom into a spiritual library, a sanctuary where he could escape the crass commercialism of his life. He meditated for hours, seeking to quiet his mind and open a channel to the other side. The members of the Memphis Mafia, grounded and worldly men, watched with a mixture of confusion and concern. They would walk past his door and hear him talking. Not on the phone. They would hear him having full, impassioned conversations with no one. He would laugh. He would argue. He would weep. He was talking to Jesse. Through his readings and meditations, Elvis constructed a complex spiritual narrative around his twin. He came to believe that he and Jesse were two halves of the same soul, and that in the womb, a choice had been made. Jesse, the more spiritually advanced soul, had chosen to return to the ethereal plane, leaving Elvis behind to experience the material world. It was Elvis's mission to learn life's lessons, and then, one day, reunite with Jesse, making their soul whole again. This belief both comforted him and haunted him. It explained his emptiness, but it also cemented a devastating survivor's guilt at the very core of his being. He felt he had literally stolen Jesse's life force, his breath, his place on earth. Every dollar he earned, every sold-out show, every gold record, felt like a debt he could never repay. This guilt was the dark engine of his famous generosity. He gave away cars and houses like they were trinkets because he felt he didn't deserve any of it. It was also the seed of his self-destruction. How could he care for a body he believed wasn't truly his? Why protect a life that was lived at the expense of his better half? He was a caretaker, a placeholder, waiting for the day he could return what he had stolen. But this spiritual awakening was a direct threat to the Elvis Presley enterprise. Colonel Tom Parker, the carnival barker turned manager who controlled Elvis with an iron fist, saw no profit in enlightenment. He saw Geller and the weirdo books as a dangerous cancer, infecting his prize asset with ideas above his station. The colonel didn't want a mystic. He wanted a movie star. He wanted a product. He began a campaign to isolate Elvis from his new spiritual lifeline, to pull him back down to earth. The confrontation was inevitable, a clash between the sacred and the profane, and the colonel, a man who never lost a fight, was about to make a move that would throw Elvis into the darkest period of his life, severing his connection to the only thing that gave him peace, the voice of his brother. The breaking point came in 1965. Colonel Parker, his face a mask of cold fury, confronted Elvis. He saw the spiritual quest as a direct threat to his control and, more importantly, his income. He gave Elvis a brutal ultimatum. It's all this spiritual crap in Geller, or it's me and your career. To Elvis, it was an impossible choice. His career was the only way he knew how to live for two. His spiritual search was the only way he could understand why. Trapped, heartbroken, and terrified of losing everything, Elvis buckled. At the colonel's command, a bonfire was made of Elvis's spiritual library. Hundreds of books, his guides, his solace, were reduced to ash. He was forced to banish Larry Geller from his inner circle. The colonel had surgically removed what he saw as the tumor of intellectual curiosity, and in doing so, he plunged Elvis into a spiritual void. He had severed the telephone line to the other side, leaving Elvis alone with the silence. And the silence was deafening. What followed were the Hollywood years, a creative and spiritual wasteland. The colonel imprisoned him in a golden cage, forcing him into a relentless series of bland, formulaic musicals. He was no longer an artist. He was a product, churning out 3 forgettable movies a year. He hated it. He hated the songs. He hated the scripts. He hated the shell of himself he saw on screen. Cut off from his spiritual search, the voice of Jesse in his mind transformed. It was no longer a guiding light. It was a voice of pure scorn, a phantom critic mocking him for selling his soul, for betraying their shared purpose. The emptiness became an abyss, and he began to fill it with pills, prescription medication, uppers to get through the meaningless days on set, downers and sleeping pills to survive the long, empty nights. He wasn't just numbing the boredom. He was trying to medicate a spiritual wound. He was trying to silence the ghost of his twin, who now screamed at him from the depths of his drug-addled consciousness. The man who had sought to purify his spirit was now systematically poisoning his body. The duality had become a civil war. By 1967, Elvis Presley was a ghost of a different kind. He was a walking shadow of his former self, a pop culture punchline. His music was irrelevant. His movies were a joke. He was 32 years old, and his career was, for all intents and purposes, over. He was trapped in his Hollywood prison, isolated in his Beverly Hills mansion, a king in exile. He had lost his connection to his muse, to his audience, and to the spirit world that had given him meaning. He had hit rock bottom. But it is only from the deepest darkness that a star can be reborn. A single television producer had a radical idea: to unplug Elvis from the Hollywood machine and put him back on a stage, alone, with nothing but a guitar and his own demons. It was a terrifying gamble. It would either be the greatest comeback in music history, or a final, humiliating public implosion. The year was 1968. America was a nation in turmoil, and Elvis Presley was a forgotten relic. The offer for a televised Christmas special was meant to be a safe, family-friendly affair. But a fire had been relit within him. He saw it as his last chance. A chance to fight back against the Colonel, to shed the synthetic skin of the movie star, and to reintroduce himself to the world, and to himself. He rejected the cheesy Christmas sweaters. He demanded a real audience. He demanded to be dangerous again. The result was The Singer Presents Elvis television special. It was more than a concert. It was an exorcism broadcast live to the nation. When he stepped onto that small, square stage, clad in black leather, he was a man transformed. This wasn't the smiling, harmless movie actor. This was a hungry, raw, coiled serpent of a performer. The black leather wasn't a costume. It was armor. It was a declaration of war against the pastel-colored prison he'd been living in. He was reclaiming his identity. On that stage, surrounded by his old bandmates, he was not just singing songs. He was testifying. The raw power, the palpable anger, the heartbreaking vulnerability was the sound of a man fighting for his very soul. He was tapping directly into the primal duality that had defined him since birth. He was channeling the raw energy of the phantom twin, the untamed spirit who had never been shackled by fame or fear. He was singing for his life, and for the life that was stolen in that Tupelo shack 33 years earlier. It was a breathtaking, terrifying, and triumphant performance. The special was a monumental success. It wasn't a comeback. It was a reincarnation. In a single night, Elvis went from being a joke to being the king again, more relevant and powerful than ever. He had faced down his ghosts and emerged victorious. The world was his once more. But it was a hollow victory. The performance had drained him, left him empty. He had proven to the world that he was still Elvis Presley, but it did nothing to heal the wound inside. The applause faded, the lights went down, and he was still just one man, still just half a soul. The triumph of the comeback special didn't fill the void. It only illuminated its infinite depth. He had conquered the world of music for a second time, but he could not conquer the phantom in his own mind. Seeking a new kingdom to rule, he turned his eyes to the one place on earth built on illusion, a city of dazzling lights and deep shadows. The perfect gilded cage for a man haunted by what was not there. He went to Las Vegas, and it was there, in the glittering mirage of the desert, that the final, tragic act of his life would begin. Las Vegas was his coronation and his prison. He opened at the International Hotel in 1969 and became the city's reigning deity. The shows were spectacular feats of showmanship, with Elvis as the high priest in rhinestone-studded jumpsuits, commanding his audience like a god. For a time, he felt invincible. But the Vegas schedule was a meat grinder. 2 shows a night, for weeks on end. It was a relentless, soul-crushing routine. The pressure to be Elvis, this larger-than-life icon, every single night was immense. The man was disappearing, and the icon was all that was left. The jumpsuits grew more elaborate, the karate moves more theatrical, the songs grander and more bombastic. It was a performance of being Elvis Presley. And behind the performance, the man was crumbling. The prescription drug use escalated from a crutch to a necessity, a chemical cocktail of stimulants to get him onto the stage, and an even more terrifying arsenal of sedatives, painkillers, and sleeping pills to bring him back down and grant him a few hours of oblivion. He was chemically managing his own existence. His conversations with Jesse became more frequent, more desperate. He would confide in the few friends he trusted, like his stepbrother Rick Stanley, that he was weary of the world. He spoke often of death not as an end, but as a reunion, a homecoming. The goal was no longer to live for two, but to finally become one with his other half. He would talk about seeing his mother, Gladys, again, and finally meeting the brother he had known only as a feeling, a whisper, a lifelong ache in his soul. The desire for peace was becoming an explicit death wish. In his final months, he became a recluse in Graceland, his body bloated and broken by the years of abuse. The house was his fortress and his tomb. He was surrounded by people, but utterly alone, save for the phantom companion who had been with him since the beginning. The world saw a tragedy in slow motion, a king destroying himself. But in his mind, it may have been something else entirely, a long, painful journey home. On August 16, 1977, the journey ended. On the top floor of his silent mansion, Elvis Presley's heart gave out. The official cause was cardiac arrest, brought on by his prescription drug abuse. But the true cause was a lifetime of bearing an impossible weight. The man who felt he was born with the strength of two could no longer sustain the life of one. His death wasn't an accident. It was an inevitability. It was the end of a duet that had begun in a Mississippi shack 42 years earlier. The king was dead. The phantom was free. And the two brothers, one who never drew a breath and one who became the most famous man in the world, were, at long last, reunited. The soul was finally whole. The story of Elvis is not one of rock and roll. It is the story of a search, a lifelong, desperate search for a missing piece of his own soul. It was a search that fueled his genius, that created an immortal legend, and that, in the end, demanded the ultimate price. He was the king, but he was a king who ruled an empty kingdom, forever haunted by the ghost of the brother who was born to share his throne. If you want to uncover more of the hidden stories behind the greatest icons in music history, the stories they never wanted you to know, make sure you subscribe to Forever Elvis Stories. There is always another ghost in the machine.